For the main topic, we're going to be talking about that number one virtue for personal finance, and I'm going to be breaking down the 4 components that make it valuable to you. I'm also going to compare this virtue to its opposite to show you how important it is that we choose this virtue to be a core part of who we are. That way, we can build off of this virtue and influence our habits and our behaviors and change the overall outcome that we observe in our personal financial lives if we're unhappy with it. Dave Ramsey is known to say that you have to have an I've had it moment with where you are in life in order to go deep enough to change your behaviors or your habits or your core values for personal finance. I'll take it one step further, though. I don't think you need to have an I've had it moment. I think if you take that challenge I gave you in the story seriously and you look deep into your soul and you ask yourself, what are my values and virtues when it comes to who I am with money? I think you can become aware of what an ideal is, what I'm going to be sharing with you today. And you can say, I want that. I want to strive for that. Now, it takes time to change ourselves. It takes time to change our habits and our behaviors and to grow in maturity when we're looking so deep into ourselves. What you need to know is that it is possible, and you need to give yourself patience and grace as you are walking through making a change for yourself for the greater good of your future. The first step is going to be being aware that you want to incorporate something into your collection of values and virtues. Now let's get down to it. The most important value or virtue that you can have when it comes to personal finance is frugality. Don't click away. Stick with me here. Hear me out. This is how I define frugality. It's not being miserly, and it's not being a penny pincher, and it's not avoiding all fun. Frugality is the intentional practice of prudent economy. And I believe that we can build a healthy foundation for all of our personal financial behaviors and decisions off of this definition. Let's break down those 4 parts. Intentional practice of prudent economy. We're going to start with intentionality. I want you to ask yourself this. If you were hiring someone to manage your personal finances, would you hire someone who is going to be very intentional with every decision that they make? They're going to be thoughtful about it, and they're going to take a measured approach to their actions. Or are you going to find someone who's a little bit more spontaneous, does things by the seat of their pants? They don't really have a plan. They don't have a written plan at all. They are just kind of doing it based off of how they feel that day. I think we'd all be more comfortable with someone who's going to have a written plan in place and is going to be acting on it intentionally. Last year around this time, when I talked about intentionality, I gave the example of going to the grocery store and having a shopping list and walking out of the store with either what is on your list or a whole lot of stuff that wasn't on your list in addition. This year, let's focus on a different example. Let's talk about your smartphone. And if you don't have a smartphone, let's talk about social media. When you are sitting there and you're scrolling through TikTok or Facebook or Instagram or Snapchats, you're just kind of scrolling, going from one thing to another, seeking the next dopamine high. You're not being very intentional with it. You're just kind of looking for something until you get bored and you jump over to the next app and you start scrolling through it. And then you jump over to the first app because, the second one got boring. And before you know it, 30, 40 minutes has passed and you still haven't sent that email you promised on the phone call you were going to send a half hour ago. See, a lot of us look at our smartphones as a source of addiction, something that enables unhealthy behavior that isn't intentional. If we sat down and we mapped out how much time do I want to spend on my phone today versus how much time do I want to spend with my spouse or my friends or my family, my kids, being productive at work, we would probably organize our time very differently than how it actually gets spent if we are a slave to our addiction to social media or our smartphone. Similarly, with money, we can be acting in a way that is contrary to how it would be if we wrote out a plan and tried to follow it. Now, let's move on to part 2 of frugality, and that's going to be practice. Practice is the through line that allows us to translate our value or virtue of frugality into action, into the behavior and habits. You see, when we say something matters to us and we have a lot of thought to it, it doesn't really speak as loud as the actual action when we apply it. So it's not enough to think that you're frugal or to say that you value frugality. You have to be able to act on it. It's kind of like how last month, if you're giving gifts for the holidays and, say you put off the time, you didn't give gifts for people. You show up to the gift exchange and you're like, I thought about it. I really wanted to get you this. I think it would have worked for you. That's what I wanted to do, but I didn't. So, but it's the thought that counts, right? I mean, that lands very differently than if you would have acted on your thoughtfulness and actually gotten that gift, be it a gift of time, talent, or treasure. Okay, let's jump into part 3 of frugality, and that's going to be prudence. Now, typically when I bring up prudence, there's a question of, well, what even is the definition of prudence? Prudence is it feels kind of vague, kind of ambiguous. Let me know in the comments how you would define prudence, especially if it's different than the way I understand it. You could think of being prudent as not exposing yourself to undue risk to your well-being or financial future. Here's a quick story of an example of how I failed to exercise prudence through, well, most of my time when I was younger than 25. So growing up, my parents liked making tea, and I enjoyed drinking a cup of tea. We would make tea using a metal teapot that sat on the stove. Now, the metal teapot had a metal handle on it, so you could fill it with water, pop it on the stove, and it was designed so that the handle would heat up slower than the rest of the teapot and you could still grab it. But that metal handle could still get really hot if you left the teapot on the stove for a long period of time. So if I wanted a cup of tea and I put the kettle on, if I waited until it was just barely hot enough for my cup of tea, the handle wouldn't be so hot that it would burn me. It would be warm, but I got in the habit of, well, why do I need to go get an oven mitt to grab the teapot when it's designed for me to just pick it up? Well, there's an undue risk that I burn my hand, and my parents called me out on it. They're like, Jay, don't grab the teapot with your bare hand. I did this in my teens. I did this into my early 20s. I grabbed the teapot with my bare hand. And guess what? A handful of times, I got burned. I went about this habit that was giving me attention, even though it was exposing me to undue risk. I don't need to risk burning my hand. There's an oven mitt in the drawer right next to the oven. There's a very clear process that I'm aware of that could basically prevent me from burning my hand 100% of the time. And it's simple. It doesn't cost me any extra energy. The oven mitt is right there. And over again, I choose to put my hand at risk. I still get grief about it today when I go visit for the holidays. We put the kettle on for tea and it's like, well, don't let Jay grab the teapot. Here's my question to you. In your personal financial life, what kind of behavior is the equivalent to grabbing a hot teapot with your bare hand and knowing that you're probably going to be okay? You think you're going to be okay most of the time, but there's something deep down that tells you this is risky, and you've either been burned or you're afraid that you're going to be burned. See, when it comes to the discipline that is required to exercise an intentional practice of prudence, we're going to just say that. It takes discipline. That discipline can be hard. Even when we recognize and answer the question, what is our hot teapot? We need to ask ourselves, though, burning our hand is unpleasant. Struggling with living paycheck to paycheck or under a pile of debt is unpleasant. It is emotionally distressing. We are experiencing anxiety when our personal financial life is going off the rails. Anxiety is experiencing failure in advance of that failure becoming crippling. And that anxiety from poor personal financial situations can be hard. So discipline is hard, but living in financial distress is hard. We get to pick which hard we want. Again, if you were going to hire someone, would you hire someone who's going to be anxious about the way that they're managing your money? Or are you going to hire the person who is disciplined? Okay, time for the fourth and final part of frugality, and that's going to be economy. Now, when I say economy, I don't want you to think of like the global economy, or if you're going to the mall, spending a whole bunch of money is good for the economy. No, when I say economy for frugality, I'm saying efficiency, maximizing the efficiency of your dollar to the happiness that it produces. You can spend, save, give, or burn your dollar. We are only going to make a finite amount of money in our lifetime. We have a finite amount of time on this earth. We can either choose to inefficiently pursue happiness, to pursue a future without a lot of thought, without a lot of plan, without a lot of discipline, or we can try to maximize our happiness or utility per dollar spent, saved, and given. So economy is maximizing our happiness or utility per dollar that we get to be in charge of in our lifetime. Now, I covered this last year and I dove into what the 80-20 rule was. It was episode 4 of the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. I encourage you to go listen to that one if you want me to really give you a deep dive on the 80-20 rule. But What I'm going to give you today is a personal example of how we exercised economy in the opposite way that you would expect. If you've been listening to me for a while, you know that I moved from Utah to Kansas City a couple years ago. And in doing so, my wife and I moved from a condo to our first house. I was a huge proponent of trying to get the smallest mortgage possible. I wanted to try to put us in a position where it was so small that we could knock it out within like 5 years. I wanted us to be financially independent of debt. So our original price range that we were looking at for houses was way below what we could actually afford. And I mean, what we can actually reasonably afford. What we ended up buying was definitely within our means. So we ended up looking at a lot of houses that were either really small or really old or in a state of significant disrepair. There were some nightmares that we ended up looking through. But on the whole, after a handful of houses, we realized that we were shooting way below what was going to be reasonable for us, given what we could afford. We realized that we weren't going to be very happy with the house, even if we were financially independent and of debt, entirely mortgage-free in 5 years. If we were to look at more of a 10-year or even a 15-year track record, getting, say, either a 20-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage and paying on it aggressively, well, we could get a house that would cover a lot more of our needs. We were looking at something that was covering half of our needs and wants for a house or less. And we shifted away from something that was on the low end to things that were closer to a dream home, but not quite. The 80-20 rule says that we should be looking for something that has about 80% of what we would really want in a house. And that things only start to get really ridiculously expensive as we're trying to get that 80% of our wants up to 100% of our wants. That path is going to cost you the most money. It's the least efficient use of your home buying dollars, and it would have been for us. But our problem wasn't that we were trying to fill up all of our needs. We were on the other end of it. We weren't trying to put enough of our needs into it because we were spending too much focus on not spending money. The prudent thing, the economical thing, the frugal thing for us to do was to choose a bigger house that was going to be more accommodating in the long run. Before we consider the opposite of frugality, I want you to think about this concept of economy. What are ways that you could be more economical and maximize your happiness per dollar spent, saved, or given this week? How can you be more efficient with your spending, saving, and giving now? Okay, frugality, the intentional practice of prudent economy. This is what I believe should grow from a value to our core virtue for personal finance. I think it makes an excellent litmus test for our financial decisions. And if you are not convinced that this is a healthy way for us to structure our internal decision-making mechanisms that make us us with money, let's consider the opposite of frugality. The opposite of intentionality, I'm going to say, is thoughtlessness. The opposite of practice, the opposite of telling our money what to do, putting our intentionality into practice, is to let everything else kind of influence what we do. We're going to be more reactive. We're going to be digressing based off of our environment and our thoughtless whims. Next, the opposite of prudence. If prudence is minimizing our exposure to undue risk, then the opposite would be unwise decisions that are unsound. Unsound decisions expose us to risk that is unnecessary. Lastly, let's talk about that efficiency, that economy. The opposite of being economical is being wasteful. And so the opposite of frugality is the thoughtless digression into unsound wastefulness. Now, does any of that sound positive? If you were to describe someone who you hire to manage your money as thoughtlessly digressing into unsound wastefulness of your dollars, would you fire them? If so, why? Does that need to be answered? Would you rather have someone who's frugal, disciplined, and frugal? And if you would rather hire someone who's disciplined and frugal to manage your money, well, how's that different than the way that we want to be for ourselves? Now, if you haven't had your I've had it moment with your personal finances, and today's episode stirs something inside of you to make a personal change, Well, I want you to think about it, and I want you to think about it over the next week. I challenge you to be reflective and introspective about frugality, about yourself, and try to know what makes you, you, with your personal financial decisions. And by becoming more frugal, how can that change your hope-filled financial future? Well, I certainly hope today's episode was thought-provoking and that it helps you as we all continue to budget bravely and enjoy our hope-filled financial futures.